Now we will shift our focus to a building's architectural characteristics. The first one we will explore is the relationship of solids to voids in a wall, or the proportion of window and door openings to wall surface area in the exterior wall of a building. Think of windows as being the eyes of a building. When there are no or few openings in a building wall, it seems forbidding, not inviting. When we look at this building, do we see any eyes? Here is an after picture of the same wall. The new business owners in downtown Asheville, North Carolina decided to add windows, which improves the street's appearance as well as increases the feeling of refuge. Articulation refers to elements that project out or are recessed to create a more interesting and less monotonous appearance, as well as divide a building's facade into parts that make it more human scale. Elements of articulation include awnings, balconies, bay windows, recessed doors, and other architectural details. The roof is a major visual element and should be carefully considered as to the proportion, texture, color, and compatibility with the proposed building style and those of neighboring buildings. Similarities in roof shapes create visual continuity in the streetscape. The building on the right is new construction. Because the roof shape and other architectural details are similar to the building on the left, it fits in with its neighbors, even though it was built about 100 years later. What kind of building material can be seen from the street? Brick, stone, wood, metal, concrete block, plywood, vinyl siding, or other substances. Ornamentation and trim are decorative elements including tiles, shutters, glass block, stone or wood carving, columns, or other features that add interest to a building. What colors are used on the building? Do they add or detract from the community's appearance? As noted in the book Design First, authors David Walters and Linda L. Brown refer to the architectural characteristic of shadow patterns on buildings, or the visual interest created by projections and setbacks. So far, we've talked about where we feel at ease in our surroundings, basic design principles, how to create the feeling of being in an outdoor room, and the architectural characteristics of buildings. Next, we'll talk about how buildings are placed on streets. At the turn of the previous century, cities and towns were designed for pedestrians. This meant that sidewalks were wide enough to accommodate groups of people, and buildings were placed next to the sidewalk so those walking by could look in the windows. Merchants prided themselves on attractive window displays to entice people walking by to come inside. Windows also had the advantage of promoting interactions between people walking by and those shopping or working inside. The buildings themselves were interesting to look at. Often they were built with patterns in their brickwork, had special carving or other kind of ornamentation on the facade to catch the eye of passers-by. The buildings were part of marketing the business. Buildings were designed to have an individual identity. They were also designed to fit in with neighboring structures. Buildings were often constructed of materials that were available locally, so a regional type of architecture sometimes developed. Buildings were meant to be permanent. Property owners were generally local, so they wanted buildings that would reflect favorably on them, their families, and their businesses. When they built new buildings, they assumed these structures would be there for several generations. Many buildings were 2 or more stories high. Owners of the buildings sometimes had their store on the ground floor and lived upstairs. Later on, they may have rented out the upstairs for office space. Buildings were built next to one another on the same block, so it was easy to walk from store to store. Signs were placed at a height and location where people could see them from the street. They were attached to the face of the building or projected across the sidewalk. Signs can be works of art as well. Trees were planted next to the curb. This provided shade for the people walking by and made the buildings cooler. On-street parking took care of the needs of people who drove to town. Where tree lawns did not exist, author Ned Crankshaw notes in Creating Vibrant Public Spaces that parked cars were the only physical obstruction between pedestrians and moving cars. In that sense, they provided a real buffer for pedestrians from passing traffic and added to their sense of security. The same can be said today. As we discussed earlier, the buildings and trees lining the street formed an edge, gave a feeling of enclosure, and provided a sense of refuge, like being in an outdoor room. Downtown was the heart of the community, since it was the center for people to live, shop, work, and worship. There were civic buildings as well as public spaces for people to gather. These public buildings and spaces are also known as the public realm. Downtown was and still is the place to remember notable people and events. It's where our memories are, where we commemorate our past, and where we continue to celebrate special events today. The Parade of Nations takes place every summer in downtown Waynesville, North Carolina, as part of the Folkmoot Festival.